some individuals or groups of being targeted by hateful language. Interestingly, these accusations originate across the political spectrum. Sometimes, the consequences for the public that result from these conflicts about hate speech can be costly, such as when Clark College canceled classes in October of last year because a rally was organized and staged there by the Patriot Prayer Group. Or when taxpayers or students and their parents have to pay additional money for security to monitor these kinds of conflicts. Now, the link between a lax and uncritical tolerance of hate speech and the rise of hate crimes has been repeatedly demonstrated in history. This alone should give us pause to consider this topic seriously. Now, in the United States, we have the First Amendment of the Constitution. Recently, many nationally distributed articles and social media posts have called for more strict regulation of so-called hate speech in public spaces, such as on campuses or on social media platforms. Some voices have answered these requests by labeling them as unjust censorship of citizens' free speech rights, guaranteed by the First Amendment of the US Constitution. So, there are many reasons for us to talk about hate speech.
Just to summarize, reasons for talking about this topic are that it's important to explore together ways to recognize and respond to hate speech. There are legal guidelines set by the US Supreme Court, and if we're going to have an informed conversation, we need to understand what those are. In order to have an informed conversation, we need to really clarify the key terms that are used in debates on regulating hate speech. And finally, we all have questions raised by the problems of hate speech in our community. It's important to know before we begin what this forum is not about. This is not intended to be sorry. It's not intended to be a defense of any group's political agenda. It's not meant to be an excuse for us to grandstand or to invite any of us to do so tonight. It's not meant to provide expert legal advice or legal counsel on how the First Amendment works. That's not our area of expertise. And it's not really meant to be an exhaustive survey on key insights on hate speech. We don't have time for that. So what we'll be doing is simply introducing you to some key terms, explaining where we're coming from and why we are here to do this, and then start offering some examples and an opportunity for all of us to discuss and explore the ideas. So, who are we? Arif Humayun is our founder of Circle of Peace. He'll just mention very briefly something about the program.
Well, thank you. Let me say I'm not the founder, the co-founder.
Oh,
is okay. The troublemaker is sitting right here in the audience, right there. He started this idea. And I have the covenants of Circle of Peace framed there on the table. And I also have a small handout, which is right sitting in front of the table. Feel free to take that, and the web site address is there, and the website is active. Somebody mentioned it was not. I just checked, it is active. So you can sign up the covenant there, or email us, and we'll make you the member, and we welcome you. It's a choice, though. There's no compulsion in that. So with that, I have handed back to you, Michael.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela.
Yeah. So you have our bios already. We won't really get into that. But just to know more about Circle of Peace, it's an organization that is a non-sectarian, nonprofit, grassroots, worldwide initiative of individuals who represent a diversity of beliefs. It's a unifying platform for people of faiths and also non-faiths who aspire to a more peaceful world. And it's a group that brings together people across religious, ethnic, and cultural divides to strengthen the common bond of humanity. So together, we have decided this is a topic worth exploring, and that's what brings us here. Before we get started, we want to let you know something also about our primary sources, because we're not really legal scholars, as I mentioned. We're people who did research and a lot of study, did a lot of reading, and then talked with each other. So it's important to know our sources. As we are choosing them, we are careful to find some sources that represent a variety of views. We wanted to find experts in the field who write for or are quoted by reputable publishers and news outlets. And we've been careful to avoid representing any extreme positions on either side due to questionable reliability of sources. So that's what we've been looking at. Here's one example. Nadine Strossen is a professor of law at New York Law School. She wrote this book called Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. She has also been the president or past president of the ACLU. Her book summarizes the Supreme Court's current interpretation of the First Amendment, and it's the one that is widely accepted across the political spectrum. So I may say ACLU, some of you may think, oh boy, she's on the side there. But her book really does just summarize the commonly held understanding of how the First Amendment works in this country currently. Another author we've drawn from is Jonathan Haidt, and he wrote a book called The Coddling of the American Mind. He really concerns himself with the topic of hate speech on campus and how students are responding to it, how campus codes are starting to sometimes cut down on free speech on campus, but also what that looks like and what the consequences are. He might be somebody you will want to explore also. Now, 2 weeks ago, we discovered this author, Andrew Marantz. He wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times, and it was a really interesting commentary on presenting some new arguments about how we might rethink our understanding of the First Amendment. So he will be coming at the end of the presentation with his view, along with this speaker and professor, law professor at Wake Forest University, whose name is Shannon Gilraith. And he also has an interesting spin on how we might interpret the First Amendment at this point in our history. So all of those are the sources that we'll be referring to. We show them to you now so that we can just reference them, but at the end there's another bibliography and you'll get that information as well.
To stay focused tonight and to avoid confusion, we want to remind everyone that the topic is about addressing hate speech and not hate crimes or bullying. Just to clarify, the FBI defines a hate crime as a traditional offense like murder or arson or vandalism with an added element of bias. For the purposes of collecting statistics, the FBI defined a hate crime as, quote, a criminal offense against a person or property motivated in whole or in part by an offender's bias against a race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity. Hate itself is not a crime. The FBI is mindful of protecting the freedom of speech and other civil liberties. So that's directly from their government site. Bullying, as you may know, is commonly defined as an intentional behavior that hurts, harms, or humiliates a student either physically or emotionally, and can happen while at school or in a community or in line. Those bullying often have more social or physical power, while those targeted have difficulty stopping the behavior, typically. Now, we certainly recognize, using this Venn diagram here, that hate speech, hate crimes, and bullying often overlap. It's pretty common for hate crimes, when they occur, to be precipitated by hate speech. But for tonight, it's important for you to realize that we are talking specifically about hate speech. So, why is it in quotes? We're using hate speech in quotation marks tonight because there is no agreed upon definition among legal scholars as to what this phrase means. When we start looking more carefully at the term, we discover that it is vague, leaving it open to interpretation, especially by those in positions of authority. And then the question arises, what kind of government regulation is appropriate for problematic speech? And perhaps more importantly, who decides? Keep in mind, very important distinction here, the First Amendment restrictions on expression apply only to government agencies, federal, state, and local, with parameters set by U.S. Supreme Court rulings. Private entities like Facebook or Twitter can set their own hate speech guidelines only as long as those don't violate state or federal law. So,
Can you say that again?
yes.
Sorry.
So private entities like Facebook or Twitter, oh, before that?
Yeah, the sentence before they're about.
So First Amendment restrictions, they only apply to government agencies. So teachers, judges, government officials, people who have the power via the government to regulate speech. And that's what we're talking about. The limitations set down by the Supreme Court that we'll be talking about tonight apply to those agencies. Strossen, for example, argues that private companies like Facebook or Twitter should follow the Supreme Court guidelines when they establish their own. But that's a common misconception that a lot of people in the public have about what exactly the First Amendment restricts. So Strossen defines hate speech here, well, sort of defines it. She says it has no agreed upon definition. However, it is generally understood to have a core meaning as speech that expresses hateful or discriminatory views about certain groups. And those groups have historically been subject to discrimination, such as African Americans, Jews, women, or LGBTQ persons, or about certain personal characteristics that have been the basis for discrimination: race, religion, gender, and sexual orientation. In other words, hate speech tends to be offensive language that most often is directed at a group of people who tend to be on the margins and is usually protected by the First Amendment. At first glance, it seems like it might be best to restrict it somehow. But as we have learned, that's not necessarily true. Please keep listening and you'll see why.
So like I said earlier, laws regarding hate speech can sometimes seem kind of ambiguous. Hateful speech is neither absolutely protected, nor is it completely unprotected. So after decades of refining its rulings, the Supreme Court presently follows two principles in interpreting hate speech. And this is what we're really going to be focusing on tonight. One is called the emergency test, and the second is called the viewpoint neutrality test. So the two crucial tests are best expressed this way. Does the incident of perceived hate speech constitute an emergency? We'll look at some examples. Secondly, in choosing to regulate speech, any government entity must not punish hate speech or speech conveying any particular point of view merely because some of us, even the vast majority of us, consider its views or ideas objectionable or even abhorrent. This is called the viewpoint neutrality test. We'll examine both of these tests, look at some examples. We'll start by diving into the emergency test, and then we'll come back to the viewpoint neutrality test. So, Michael will take over here.
Okay, so first principle, the emergency test. Louis Brandeis, as many of you may have heard his name, was a Supreme Court justice who helped create the precedent for free speech we currently live by. He had a great deal of respect for the American people's ability to make critical decisions about messages we receive. And in our research, we came across this quote over and over again. Famous quote: "Only an emergency can justify repression. If a message is simply offensive, then there's no emergency. The proper response is speech, not enforced, is more speech, not enforced silence." So, under this test, the government may punish speech about public issues only. And these are the key adjectives here. So if you want to take away something tonight, see if you can hold on to these. Government can punish speech about public issues only when, in context, it poses an emergency, when it directly, demonstrably, and imminently causes a certain specific and objectively ascertainable serious harm that cannot be averted by non-censorial measures, the most important of which are counter-speech and law enforcement. So, the important idea to gain from this definition is that if an individual's specific words leads to specific harmful actions, as limited by the words of this test, then that person's speech can be curtailed in some way, or they can face other legal consequences. Currently, expression using hateful words in and of themselves is protected by the First Amendment. Sorry, there's a crucial distinction we need to make here when, and this is a common misconception that hopefully you can take away as well. This crucial distinction to make is when considering hate speech regulation between so-called hate speech that is presently protected by the emergency test, separate from hate speech that is constitutionally protected. And so what is that? Again, Strossen provides an explanation here. Although the Supreme Court has never recognized any kind of special category of hate speech that is excluded from First Amendment protection based on just the message alone, government can restrict some speech with a hateful, discriminatory message if, again, in context, it directly causes specific, imminent, serious harm. In other words, the emergency test. So, to illustrate this, we have selected some examples from the readings, from the literature, of how the spectrum of language and action works for hate speech regulation under the Supreme Court rulings on so-called hate speech. And so there are three columns here. In the left-hand column, hate speech that's protected by the First Amendment. Examples include cross-burning in general, or peaceful National Socialist march through Skokie, Illinois, or merely offensive political rhetoric. In the middle column, you see examples of hate speech that's not protected by the First Amendment. So if you decide to burn a cross on a particular family's lawn, and they have the impression that it's obviously an intended threat, that's not protected. You also can't target someone repeatedly with harassing phone calls. Another example we came across is African American employees who were newly hired to a company encountered nooses in the break room on the first day of their employment at that company. That also would be an example of hate speech that's not protected, so-called hate speech. There's also criminal actions that we're all familiar with that involve speech or language, and they're just not protected at all. You can't bribe people, you can't commit fraud or libel, perjury, any kind of true threat, vandalism, inciting a riot. Those things aren't protected by the First Amendment. Okay? So, the landmark case for establishing this interpretation of the First Amendment is Brandenburg versus Ohio, 1969. So we saw examples of this case over and over again in our research. A little background on the case. So Clarence Brandenburg, he's a Ku Klux Klan leader in rural Ohio. He organizes a rally in the summer of 1964, wherein several men in robes and hoods, some of whom are carrying firearms, first they burn a cross, and then they made some speeches. He's first charged under the current Ohio, or at that time, the Ohio Criminal Syndicalism Statute, for his participation in the rally and for the speeches he made. Brandenburg's case was ultimately overturned by the Supreme Court. So, in this speeches that he made reference to the possibility of, quote, revengeance against, the N-word, Jews and those who support them. One speech he made also claimed that, quote, our president, our Congress, our Supreme Court continues to suppress the white Caucasian race. And that's a direct quote from the case. So what was the outcome of this? Brandenburg versus Ohio set a new standard for criminal incitement, and that is called the imminent lawless action test. In Brandenburg, the court held that hate speech is protected under the First Amendment as long as it does not provoke violence. So speech, this is direct from the court ruling itself, speech constitutes constitutionally punishable incitement only if the speaker intentionally incites imminent violent or otherwise illegal conduct that is likely to occur immediately. So you have to imagine you're out on the street, you encounter a situation, you say, well, gee, this seems like a candidate for hate speech. Shouldn't this be regulated? Well, if you keep this emergency test in mind and the way the Supreme Court has ruled it, only in the case where imminent violence is likely to occur, where there's a specific person targeted, then that might be a candidate for some other sort of restriction on that person. So Angela's going to talk a little bit about the viewpoint neutrality test, the second of the two.
So as we mentioned earlier, there are two tests for regulating hate speech, and one is the one that we just reviewed, so the emergency test. The second one is this one, called the viewpoint neutrality test. This is sometimes called the content neutrality test, and this principle bars government entities from regulating speech solely because the speech's message, idea, or viewpoint is disfavored or feared to be dangerous by government officials or community members. As the court has explained, any such viewpoint-based or viewpoint discriminatory regulation would subvert not only individual liberty, but also our democratic self-government, because of the danger that officials would start to enforce it and would do so unfairly, and they might suppress unpopular ideas or information or manipulate public debate. The famous case that went along this one was from Skokie, Illinois. And what happened is that the Nationalist Socialist Party of America, basically the Nazis, requested permission to hold a neo-Nazi demonstration in Skokie, Illinois, which had a very large Jewish population. One of the things to know is that the town's population was 70,000, and of that population, 40,500 of them were Jewish people, and of that group of Jewish people, 5,000 to 7,000 of them had been survivors of the Nazi death camps. So when this event was proposed, you can imagine how upsetting it was to the town. So at first, that group's request was denied. However, it went to court. And the outcome was that public expression of ideas may not be prohibited because the ideas themselves are offensive to some of the hearers. The court recognized that this was a seriously disturbing decision and that the group itself was really disturbing. The march was really disturbing. But the problem with engrafting any kind of exception on the First Amendment for such situations is that they are indistinguishable in principle from speech that invites dispute. The viewpoint neutrality test, as we see in this example, safeguards Americans' free speech rights from government regulation based on the content of the speech. As Nadine Strossen puts it, once the government is authorized to suppress speech because of a feared harmful tendency or because of a disturbing viewpoint, the government has largely unfettered censorial power. So in other words, if the government is given the power to decide to shut down any kind of free speech because an idea seems harmful or distressing to some people, then any idea could be shut down. And I think most of us would agree that we don't want to live in a society that is like that, because the government has this unfettered power to decide what we can and can't talk about. We're going to take a look at what hate speech looks like in a few other democracies, and Michael will address that.
So, for some perspective, let's briefly look, and this is really briefly because there's a lot of examples out there, but we'll look at this issue and how it's been handled in some other countries, Now, in our research, we had heard some conflicting opinions about this, but there is some convergence on the facts. Most other democracies in the world have some form of hate speech regulations. In some places like post-war Germany, the United States itself helped put them into place. So, according to Strossen, recent experience appears to show that these laws are quite problematic for a few reasons. Vague language, reliance on subjective enforcement by those in power. And the result is that ideas are restricted, and disempowered people are often hit the hardest. And hate speech can go underground and remain unchallenged. So that's the big concern, is when we look at other examples of countries where they've put these kinds of more strict hate speech laws into practice, the unintended consequence is that the perpetrators of the hate speech, like imagine neo-Nazis in Germany, they become more and more sophisticated. They learn how to sell their message and dress themselves in a way that they come across as more palatable to the general public. And yet their message is still the same. So according to Strossen, that's a pretty common counter effect that we see in many countries. Another common one is that the very people who are intended to be protected by hate speech laws often end up becoming the targets of them, ironically. Okay, so let me give you a few examples here, recent examples. From 2013, the European Parliament acknowledged that hate speech and bias crimes were increasing in the EU countries despite their hate speech laws. Also in 2013, the European Union Fundamental Rights Agency conducted a survey of European Jews. 76% said that anti-Semitism had become worse in the countries in the last 5 years, despite the prevalence of European hate speech laws. In 1992, Human Rights Watch issued a report concluding that laws that penalize hate speech are subject to, quote, subject to abuse by the dominant racial or ethnic group. Indeed, it observed that in some of the most stringent hate speech laws have long been in place in South Africa. And under the apartheid regime, those same laws were used to target the black majority almost exclusively. In 2016, the same organization did a follow-up report. In this case, they reached a similar conclusion about hate speech laws in India, noting that they, quote, they're used to stifle political dissent, harass journalists, restrict activities of NGOs, arbitrarily block internet sites or take down content, and target religious minorities and marginalized communities such as the Dalits, the untouchables. In 2015, Agnes Calmard, director of the Columbia Global Freedom of Expression, faults hate speech laws for the tendency of government authorities to target political dissent in European countries. For example, journalist John Glenn Greenwald wrote in 2017 that cases in Turkey are common where citizens have been prosecuted under hate speech laws for criticizing the government or the military. He continues that in the UK, hate speech has come to include virulent criticism of UK soldiers fighting in Afghanistan. And he cites a 2012 case in which a British Muslim teenager by the name of Azhar Ahmad was arrested for his strongly worded Facebook post deploring British soldiers killing Afghan civilians. So to summarize, Strossen convincingly argues with many examples that the American response to hate speech tends to avoid these pitfalls. She has this quote, "Americans believe in people's abilities to make our own choices about what ideas we choose to receive, accept, and believe." Now we're going to present you a counter view to this admittedly consensus opinion.
So the interpretation of the First Amendment that we've presented to you so far has really developed over the last 75 years or so. And it's really widely accepted across the political spectrum. And that said, we're now living in an era of technology and social media that's kind of changed the context that we're living in. So, In response, a new group of scholars and thinkers have been working to develop and challenge this long-held view that we've just presented. So we're choosing to show you the ideas of two exemplars of these new ideas, this new body of work. Andrew Merritt and Shannon Galbraith are two of these thinkers who speak and write really eloquently about the need to adjust our understanding of the First Amendment. Their thinking is best summarized with this quote up here: "We can be free speech advocates without being free speech absolutists." Andrew Merritt has gone on to say, "Free speech is a bedrock value in this country, but it isn't the only one. Like all values, it must be held in tension with others, such as equality, safety, and robust democratic participation." The basis of this more nuanced interpretation of the First Amendment is rooted in the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equality to all Americans under the law. Galbraith talks about how we know that certain speech acts, or certain speech represents acts, and those acts have been deemed unconstitutional. So, for example, signs that say "whites only" at this drinking fountain have now become illegal because they constitute discriminatory action. A boss cannot say to an employee, "Have sex with me or you'll lose your job," because we call that sexual harassment, and it's illegal. So speech represents power. And some scholars argue that if we want to avoid a two-tiered society, then government needs to be more involved with helping to curtail a certain kind of speech, which Shannon Galbraith calls anti-equality propaganda or anti-equality speech. So this is speech that creates inequality for targeted groups, and it often precedes physical harm of those groups. Because of that, it sows fear, and that can lead to silencing of those groups. Anti-equality speech often helps to create a two-tier society. It helps to maintain a two-tier society because it can help to prevent its targets from participating fully in the workplace or in public life. So, for example, when people hear that homosexuality causes gay men to rape children, they might respond and be less apt to hire a gay man for a teaching position, and all of a sudden that person does not have access to a livelihood. The issue is that certain groups on the margins need protection under the law so they are not penalized for someone else's beliefs about them. The challenge then, and the tension that exists in this investigation of speech is really between the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment. Because as Andrew Merritt asks, how can we protect unpopular speech from government interference while also admitting that unchecked speech can expose us to real risks? Andrew Merritt's brainstormed some ideas about how to respond, and we want to show those to you simply as an example. They're not necessarily the answer, but they help us see how this might work in some kind of practical way. So he argues that congressional leadership really could potentially fund a national campaign to promote news literacy. Congressional leadership could potentially invest in library programming to help develop media literacy. Congressional leadership could help to build a more robust public media in the mold of the BBC. Or perhaps it could help us rethink Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act to curtail social media posts that contribute to anti-equality. Again, this isn't the answer, and we're not necessarily proponents of it, but I think it's helpful just to see what this might look like. So, let's summarize.
In summary, we have a long history of respecting Americans' freedoms to express ideas in the public sphere. But we also have those who bear the brunt of those ideas when they're conveyed in hateful language. These writers remind us that balancing freedom of expression with the value of equality is indeed a challenge. Consider a final example. Regarding a 2011 case in which the Supreme Court upheld the right of individuals to engage in extremely hurtful or offensive speech, in this case at the funerals of military veterans, the Supreme Court explained, "Speech is powerful. It can stir people to action, move them to tears of both joy and sorrow, as it did here, inflict great pain. We cannot react to that pain by punishing the speaker. As a nation, we have chosen a different course to protect even hurtful speech on public issues, to ensure that we do not stifle public debate. Undoubtedly, this topic involves an incredibly difficult array of arguments and strong emotions. As we can see from the arguments and the examples that we presented, the only certainty appears to be that there are no simple or obvious solutions in this debate. We'll just have to struggle together as a society to find the best answers." So, now's the time that we want to get you talking with each other, and we want to review the living room conversation model of conversation agreements. And you have this handout handed out to you here when you came in. And if you don't have one, raise your hand. We'll make sure you get one.
Yes.
Okay. So we're going to break into groups of about 5 or 6, and we're going to have you circle your chairs together. So we'll just let you organize yourselves into some small groups. We won't play the, I'm a teacher, so I sometimes have my kids count off 1 through 5, but I think you're adults here, you can handle it. And if you came with somebody, like a friend or a spouse, I might encourage you to sit with someone new just so you get a variety of opinions tonight. So these are the conversation agreements, if you look with me on your handout, that seem to create a situation in which people have really productive conversations, and that's what we're looking for. First, try to be curious and open to learning. Please show respect and suspend judgment. Try to find some common ground and note differences together. It's always helpful if people try and be authentic and welcome that from others. Please be purposeful and to the point. We know all of us have been in a group where someone ends up dominating simply because they have a great idea and they need to go on and on and on about it. So, if you can keep your comments shorter rather than long to let others in, that's really helpful. Also, please own and guide the conversation together. And there's some other guidelines underneath here. So there are 3 questions that we've set for you. You can take them in any order you want. Generally, I can tell you that they move from 1 through 3 from a more general perspective to a more specific perspective, sort of following the outline of our talk tonight. So the first question is, should the U.S. government restrict the freedoms of speech and assembly of any groups or individuals, and if so, under what circumstances? We'll have you talk about that. Second, is too much tolerance dangerous? Or is giving an authority the power to restrict freedom of speech and assembly even more dangerous? Finally, this is the more specific one.
How do we fairly balance the concern expressed by the First Amendment for protecting even offensive free speech with the 14th Amendment's guarantees for equal access to the opportunities of a civil society and public goods like safety? Just some light talking amongst yourselves.
Okay, so it's 6:50. It's 6:50 right now, and we're going to give people about 40 minutes to talk. We'll see how folks are doing. We'll float around here and listen in. But what we want to do is when you come back from your discussion, we'd like to have you provide to the rest of the group at least one answer to the question that your group spent the most time with. Or at least a provisional answer, or was there any kind of consensus, or perhaps you want to report out, was there some strong disagreement? Mm-hmm. We'd also like you to take note of any remaining questions that you have. and bring those back. We'll get back together here in about 40 minutes. And so why don't we have our first group congregate over here. We'll do about 5 or 6 people. And then we'll have a group here in the back corner, about 5 or 6 people. Back in that corner, maybe in the center. And then we'll have a 5th group over here in this corner.
Yeah.
Okay?
One other note, please feel free to move your chairs around. We purposefully didn't have tables, so move furniture as you need to.